Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. I'm David Feldman, the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Antisemitism, which is based here at Birkbeck. And I'd like to welcome you to this event, which we're hosting in partnership with the Centre for Civil Society and Citizenship at Northumbria University. And this collaborative event marks the publication of a new and groundbreaking collection of essays, Racialization and Religion, edited by Nasar Meer, the co-director of the Centre for Civil Society and Citizenship, a collection which brings together the study of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, a collection which challenges the extent to which the racialization of Jews and Muslims has been explored in distinct and separate debates. And it's a particular pleasure, it's particularly important for me that the Pears Institute is hosting this event, because it really is sort of, as it essential, I'd say, essential to what the Institute is trying to do, which is to reconnect debates on understanding and combating anti-Semitism with debates on understanding and combating racism and prejudice more broadly. And I see this as one important landmark event in that process. And I just want now to ask Nasar Meer to say a few words about the book.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's nice to see so many people here. Perhaps I can begin by thanking the Pears Institute and David and Jan specifically for helping us to come together this evening and organising this event. Now, this collection that we're here partly to launch this evening grew out of a special issue of the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies. And as David has indicated, the activity there was to try to bring together research on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, to bring them together and situate them to some extent within the study of race and racism. We were trying, in many respects, to speak to what's sometimes called the lingering question as to where the racialization of religious minorities sits within those debates. And I suppose one of our collective objectives was to challenge the extent to which our understanding of the racialization of Muslims and Jews remains unrelated to each other, and to the extent it's explored in distinct silos, perhaps as a series of internal debates which don't really speak to each other. So we wanted to make a historically informed, theoretically guided and empirical contribution to this activity. Now, self-evidently, such an ambitious task isn't easy, because it has to overcome, on the one hand, a narrative, a story about the emergence of race as a very secular thing, as something which emerged in the modern period, perhaps something that has its genesis in the story of Atlantic slavery and Enlightenment-informed, sanctioned colonialism. Perhaps that account's become the prevailing and entrenched view. But this historical challenge struck us as having a contemporary significance, because at the time we were writing, we were observing a number of cross-national data sets, including the Pew Global Attitude Survey, which was reporting very sharp increases in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic sentiment across Europe in terms of both attitude and indeed behaviour, as we discuss in the book. Now, one problem we faced then is that whilst the two phenomena appear to be shadowing each other, rising and falling alongside one another across different national contexts, there wasn't really a space where there was a space, let's say, where there should have been a set of theoretical tools to help us to understand those similarities and those differences. Perhaps also, to some extent, this question about bringing together the study of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia is less an analytical one and often quite a political problem, namely an opposition to placing Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the same tier as each other, as well as in the same register as race. So in this book, in attempting to bring to bear ideas of racialization in the conceptualization of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, we're really trying to engage in a degree of historical revision. When does race begin? Oh, does it begin with Atlantic slavery, or does it have a provenance prior to that? Well, we speak to that issue. Secondly, we're trying to pursue a degree of analytical precision. What parts of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are comparable? Where can we compare? And where is it a false analysis to try and pursue that activity? But thirdly, of course, we're very politically cognizant. We're aware that these debates don't occur within a vacuum. There's a wider prevailing political contestation, which inevitably feeds and informs research agendas. And I'm really delighted to say that we've brought together what I think are some of the leading authors on this topic in both a special issue and subsequently managed to persuade two leading figures to write afterwards in the form of Tariq Modood and David Feldman. So I'm looking forward to this evening's discussion. Thank you very much.
As Nasar said, we have three speakers this evening. They'll talk for about 10 minutes each, and then the discussion will be opened up to questions and contributions more widely from you. And then at the end of the evening, there'll be a word from John Solomos, who is the editor of the series in which the book appears. So our speakers, I'll introduce all three now so that it'll sort of encourage a flow later. Our first speaker will be Tariq Modood, who is Professor of Sociology, Politics and Public Policy at Bristol University and the founding director of the University Research Centre for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. We'd be here all evening if I listed his publications. I'll simply say that the second edition of his important book, Multiculturalism, has been published this year. Our second speaker is Dr. Brian Klug, a senior research fellow and tutor in philosophy at St. Benet's Hall at Oxford University. He's currently working on Wittgenstein, on culture and religion, and race, racialization, multiculturalism, and Jewish identity. His most recent book is Being Jewish and Doing Justice, Bringing Argument to Life. Thirdly, Pnina Werbner is Professor Emerita in Sociology at the University of Kiel. Her fields of interest include ritual and religion, cultural politics, migration and diaspora. Her most recent monographs, Imagined Diasporas Amongst Manchester Muslims and Pilgrims of Love, The Anthropology of a Global Sufi Cult, are the second and third in her Manchester Migration trilogy, which trace the processes of Pakistani migration, community formation, religious transnationalism, and diaspora over a 50-year period. So, without any more from me, I'll ask Tariq to come up here and speak.
As you've heard, we're on the clock. So I'm going to, and I have quite a bit to say, so I'm going to speak fairly fast. Two events earlier this month, both connected to the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht, help give a context for my chapter in the book. First, the FRA, European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, published a report on Jewish perception and experience of anti-Semitism in the EU, based on an online survey. One question on the survey listed 8 potentially offensive statements made by non-Jews. It included the statement, Israelis behave like Nazis towards the Palestinians. In the opinion of 81% of respondents, a non-Jew who says this is ipso facto anti-Semitic. Another question gave a list of 6 possible views or actions by non-Jews. This was stipulated in the question, by the way, that it was by non-Jews or non-Jewish people. It included supports boycotts of Israeli goods or products, and also criticizes Israel. These were considered anti-Semitic by 72% and 34% of respondents, respectively. But are they? The second event was a conference at the Jewish Museum Berlin on anti-Semitism in Europe today, at which both David and I spoke. A group of people condemned the conference in advance on the grounds that some of the speakers were anti-Israel. The implication was that the speakers in question were, for this very reason, anti-Semitic, more or less. But does anti-Israel, whatever that means, imply anti-Semitic? Both examples illustrate something that has come to be known as the new anti-Semitism, or if you prefer, anti-Semitism. New? I didn't know if that would work or not. If Ecclesiastes is right, or Koheles, there is nothing new under the sun. And certainly the phrase new anti-Semitism is not exactly novel. Once upon a time it was used to refer to what today we might call old anti-Semitism, the biologically based variety associated with fascism and Nazism. But today the old phrase has acquired a new use. It now means opposition or hostility to Israel or Zionism. At its strongest, there is the qualitative claim that anti-Zionism and hostility to Israel are per se anti-Semitic. For example, Abraham Foxman, in his book Never Again, The Threat of the New Anti-Semitism, says, I quote, "The harsh but undeniable truth is this. What some like to call anti-Zionism is, in reality, anti-Semitism. Always, everywhere, and for all time." End of quote. At other times, the claim is quantitative. It amounts to saying that predominantly and for the most part, these attitudes are anti-Semitic, and therefore, in any given case, the burden of proof is on those who deny the allegations of anti-Semitism when they are hostile to Israel. For example, Foxman again, I quote, "Most of the current attacks on Israel and Zionism are not at bottom about the policies and conduct of a particular nation state. They are about Jews." End of quote. Now, although it doesn't really make sense to make both these claims, the qualitative and the quantitative, simultaneously, as Foxman does, polemically they do come to the same thing. It's okay to criticize Israel or Zionism, but if you are against them, whatever that means, you're an anti-Semite. This essentially is the position that I examined in my chapter. The chapter revisits and revises an argument I made 10 years ago in an essay in Patterns of Prejudice called The Collective Jew, Israel and the New Antisemitism. That essay seems to have given rise to a certain amount of misunderstanding, which I can best convey via an imaginary dialogue with an imaginary critic. Now, although imaginary, this little dialogue that I'm about to enact is uncannily like real-life exchanges that I've had over and over again. It goes something like this. I'm going to have to play 2 parts, okay? A critic of me and me replying. Critic. So you're Brian Klug. You're the academic who denies that criticism of Israel is ever anti-Semitic. Me. No, actually, I've never denied that. Critic. Come off it, I've read all about it. You think criticism of Israel is political, and therefore it isn't anti-Semitic. Me. That's funny, because I've never written that. I've never even thought it. Critic. Yes, you have. And how can you, a so-called scholar, be so naive? Don't you know that anti-Zionism is just a mask behind which anti-Semitism hides? At which point I decide to surrender to the inevitable so as to bring the conversation to an end. Me. No, really? I had no idea, but thanks for informing me. My aim in the chapter is to dispel some of the conceptual confusion about anti-Semitism in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian and Israeli-Arab conflicts. As a result, I hope to help clear the way for a more considered discussion of cases and to throw into sharper relief the complexity that cannot be eliminated from this subject. There are no easy answers. My method is adapted from the strategy that Socrates adopts in Plato's Republic. Socrates sets out to discover what justice is in an individual by first looking for justice in a city or a state. He does this on the analogy of small and large letters. The idea is that it's easier to see justice writ large in the city than writ small in the individual. Well, my task is the opposite of Socrates's. The complexity that I wish to bring into focus is difficult to make out on the large scale of an international conflict, but relatively easy to see in miniature. And I therefore borrow Plato's device but use it in reverse. I first examine anti-Semitism writ small on an imaginary ride on a number 73 London bus, and then transpose the analysis to the larger stage of the Middle East. Now, even if you don't get anything out of the chapter that is actually helpful, you might still enjoy reading the 5 scenarios of what happens on the number 73 bus as it passes through the borough of Hackney. I certainly had a lot of fun writing this. The cast of imaginary characters who are thrown together on this imaginary ride include Lucy, the non-Jewish conductor, Rabbi Cohen from Stamford Hill, and a passenger, the ubiquitous Mrs. Goldstein, also a passenger, and finally Mr. Jones, a neighbour of Lucy's in Billericay, where she lives, and a keen bird watcher. You'd be surprised that that's very relevant, actually, to the analysis. So as to give you an incentive to buy the book, I won't divulge what happens on the bus, but the upshot is this. I argue that anti-Semitism is best defined not by an attitude towards Jews, but by a conception, an answer to the question, what is a Jew? At the heart of anti-Semitism, as I see it, is a figment or fiction, the Jew, in scare quotes. Even if some real Jews fit the stereotype, the Jew towards whom the anti-Semite feels hostile is not a real Jew at all. The figure of the Jew is a frozen image projected onto the screen of a living person. The fact that the image might on occasion fit the reality does not change its status, it remains an image. Consider the case of Peter Rachman, whose name is synonymous with slum landlord. In the 1950s, Rachman ruled over a property empire based in Notting Hill, charging his low-income tenants high rents that they could barely afford. Rachman was Jewish. He was also, apparently, money-grubbing, unscrupulous, shady, exploitative, all of which are stock themes in the figure of the Jew. Thus, he was also Jewish, in quotes. Anti-Semitism consists in collapsing this distinction, so that to be Jewish is to be Jewish. The image, so to speak, fastens onto the reality. It uses the reality to proclaim itself falsely as real. The rats are underneath the piles, the Jew is underneath the lot, is how T.S. Eliot puts it in 2 infamous lines of poetry. But underneath the lot is not the real Jew, the flesh and blood Jew. It is Eliot's Jew, the figure of the Jew, a kind of cud chewed over and spat out by the poet. For Eliot, this distinction between real Jews and his Jews is a distinction without a difference. And there's the rub. Thinking that Jews are really Jews is precisely the core of anti-Semitism. Now, here is a thumbnail sketch of the anti-Semitic figure of the Jew that I use in my chapter. This is not me speaking, okay? I'd say this in advance in case there's anyone in the room who is disposed to regard me as an anti-Semite. The Jew belongs to a sinister people, set apart from all others, not merely by its customs, but by a collective character. Arrogant, yet obsequious, legalistic, yet corrupt, flamboyant, yet secretive. Always looking to turn a profit, Jews are as ruthless as they are tricky. Loyal only to their own, wherever they go they form a state within a state, preying upon the societies in whose midst they dwell. Their hidden hand controls the banks, the markets, and the media, and when revolutions occur or nations go to war, it's the Jews, cohesive, powerful, clever, and stubborn, who invariably pull the strings and reap the rewards. End of the thumbnail sketch. Now let me clarify the status of this thumbnail sketch and its use in defining anti-Semitism. The content is based on the anti-Semitic discourse of a certain period, roughly from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th. On the one hand, it is not intended as a definition. In other words, to be an anti-Semite, it's not necessary to tick every box in that thumbnail sketch. There are themes that I have omitted, and different themes are more prominent than others at different times or in the discourse of different anti-Semitic groups or individuals. And over time, they mutate. On the other hand, these themes are not peculiar to the modern period. Many of them recur in different epochs. Moreover, they are portable. They are detachable from any particular ideological context. They can be applied to Jews, whether Jews are seen as a people, a nation, an ethnic group, a cultural group, a religious community, a class, a genetic race, or whatever. And although this character is not identical across time, there are, to borrow and adapt an idea from Wittgenstein, family resemblances between the figure of the Jew at one period and the figure of the Jew at another, overlapping traits that lead us, with good reason, to employ the same word, anti-Semitism. So this sketch of the figure of the Jew is just that, a sketch. It is rough and ready, not precise and polished, more art than science. But it is useful, and more than useful. It is useful to have a sketch along these lines, however sketchy it might be, because without it, the word anti-Semitism is left floating in midair. Without it, without some such sketch, the word is empty. But a word that is both empty and emotive is dangerous, and anti-Semitism is an emotive word. Thus, emptied of meaning, the word is worse than useless. It is a loose cannon, which is why the thumbnail sketch is more than useful. Using the figure of the Jew, I go from the model bus to the Middle East. I use it to arrive at a verdict on the new anti-Semitism thesis, and my verdict is... Oh, unfortunately, I'm out of time. So if you want to know, do buy the book.
Well, good evening. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm told by some people that I am recorded as having the earliest use of the word Islamophobia in the English language, in print. I don't know whether that's true, but that's what they tell me, and they cite something, I believe, in The Independent. I know I didn't invent it, so I don't know where I got it from. But I definitely, if not read it somewhere, definitely heard it somewhere. And indeed, when I did start using the term Islamophobia and tried to some extent, contribute to it and to make it my own, I very much emphasized that I understood it in terms of anti-Muslim racism, which is, for instance, very different to the uses that the famous Runnymede Commission on Islamophobia, which then gave the term its popular currency or major currency. So I'm, of course, pleased that Islamophobia studies has grown in the way that it has in the last couple of decades, and very pleased that this volume is focused on racialization. Additionally, of course, I'm very pleased that this project is led by Nasar Meer, once a PhD student of mine, now a prolific collaborator and co-author, as well as, of course, an independent scholar in his own right. But I'd like to offer a certain cautionary note. Having said the things I'm pleased about and welcoming what this volume is trying to do, I'd like to offer a cautionary note about racialization in relation to Islamophobia and the study of Muslims. Nasser, as he mentioned, kindly invited me to do a short afterword for the book, and I'd just like to read this short afterwards, and I think it fits into the time available. It was not very long ago that Anglophone scholars of racism understood racism in terms of biology, and specifically in terms of the black-white binary. At the same time, other scholars, especially in continental Europe, understood racism in terms of anti-Semitism, especially in the recent biologized forms that Europe manifested in the 20th century. When it began to be clear that these two paradigms were failing to capture some contemporary experiences, such as anti-Asian cultural racism in Britain or anti-Arab cultural racism in France, some scholars began to move away from these paradigms. Even so, the pull of these biologistic models was so strong that even today, many scholars of racism understand cultural racism in quasi-naturalistic terms, seeing culture as a code for the biological racisms that they find more intelligible. West European Muslims have found these scholarly hegemonies an especially galling obstacle to getting academia and fellow citizens to understand the exclusionary discourses and misrecognitions that Muslims are subject to. Following the assertive Muslim agency triggered off by the Satanic Verses affair and other Muslim controversies, as Muslims responded to such hostilities and articulated their misrecognition, they were constantly told, especially in Britain, that there's no such thing as anti-Muslim racism because Muslims are a religious group and not a race. Hence, Muslims could legitimately ask for toleration and religious pluralism, but not for inclusion in anti-racist egalitarian analyses and policy initiatives. While this view continues to be expressed even today, and some deny that there is a racism that could be labelled Islamophobia, it no longer has the hegemony it once did. In that sense, as this volume manifests, the concept of Islamophobia and the study of Islamophobia has come of age. It is being studied in terms of its specificity, untrammeled by narrow paradigms of racism based on other times and other oppressions, and studied alongside more familiar racisms, such as anti-Semitism, as in this book, and anti-black racism. While then understanding some contemporary treatment of Muslims and aspects of their societal status in terms of racialization is an advance, the conceptualization of Muslims in the West should not, I think, be reduced to racialization or any other othering theoretical frame, such as, for example, Orientalism. Minorities are never merely projections of dominant groups, but have their own subjectivity and agency through which they challenge how they are perceived or misperceived, and seek to not be defined by others, but to supplant negative and exclusionary stereotypes with positive and prideful identities. Oppressive misrecognitions thus sociologically imply and politically demand recognition. Our analyses, therefore, should be framed in terms of a struggle for recognition or a struggle for representation. Moreover, recognition and related concepts are intrinsically normative concepts, and so social inquiry without a normative frame may capture Islamophobia, but will short of a full engagement with it or bring out what is the best way to respond to it. For example, everyone will agree that Islamophobia must be distinguished from reasonable criticism of Muslims and aspects of Islam. But not only is this a difficult distinction to make, but it begs the question, what are reasonable criticisms that Muslims and non-Muslims may make or discuss in relation to some Muslim views about, say, gender or education or secularism? Not only must the study of Islamophobia not squeeze out the possibility of such discussion, but by showing us where it becomes Islamophobic, by caricaturing, by assuming that all Muslims think in a particular way, by creating a climate in which reasonable dialogue is impossible. So showing us where it becomes Islamophobic, it should help to guide us onto the terrain of reasonable dialogue. Merely identifying the unreasonable and the populist is not enough. Our frames of analysis should lead us to the reasonable, to what criticisms may be made of Muslims and or Islam, and what criticisms that Muslims want to make of contemporary Western societies, too, are worthy of hearing. Let me give another example. it is generally agreed that Islamophobia is part of the backlash against multiculturalism, and this is indeed important to bring out, given, especially in Britain, where race and or class perspectives have tended to dominate analyses in relation to minorities. We need, however, to go beyond identifying the racisms and insecurities, cultural and material, that are amongst the sources of anti-multiculturalism. We need to also identify principled and reasonable concerns that may be part of anti-multiculturalism or criticisms of aspects of multiculturalism. We therefore need a normative reference point for evaluating criticisms of multiculturalism and of offering reasoned and effective responses to such criticism. This may be to offer suitable and reflexive understandings of multiculturalism that are able to take criticisms on board, while also pointing out the weaknesses in the criticisms. Or it may be to offer an alternative standpoint. What is not adequate is to merely identify and rhetorically condemn the backlash without considering what is right and wrong in the criticism of multiculturalism. Or, to return to the main example, popularly expressed criticism and anxieties about Muslims and Islam. In the 1970s and 1980s, a certain type of anti-racism developed in the academy and in certain polities like Britain. While critically alerting society to various forms of direct and indirect racism, it tended to frame non-white minorities in terms of racism, even to the point of creating a singular subject as the victim of racism, namely blacks, as if such groups of people had no identities of their own that were equal to that of the identities ascribed to them by white people or by the political project of blackness. I hope in this brief afterwards, or this brief talk, that I've indicated that there is a danger that anti-Islamophobia could go the same way as the earlier form of anti-racism, and some of the ways that this can be avoided, namely to ensure that Islamophobia or racialization does not become the primary analytical frame for the study of Muslims in the West, but that it is situated within a broader struggle for recognition frame. Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you for inviting us, Nasar. This is an excellent collection. I've read some of the other essays, not only my own, and I do commend it. And 10 minutes is not much time to be able to say anything of any meaningful. Now, the title of my own essay in the collection is Folk Devils and Racist Imaginaries in a Global Prism, Islamophobia and Antisemitism in the 21st Century. And there is some way in which I can get my cartoon to show up. It's very important, the cartoon, because I've only got 10 minutes. So while the technology is being dealt with, oh, well, there we are. So, you know that Robert Browning was once asked about a poem of his, what does it mean? And he said, when I wrote the poem, God and I knew what it meant. Now, only God knows. And it's a bit like that with my essay, because when I reread it, I thought, gosh, did I write this? What does it mean? So, but hopefully you'll be able to read it, and anyone who wants it, I can send it to them by email. I'm quite... I don't know about that until Taylor and Francis brings out a paperback. Well, I want to explain something about my motivation in writing this essay. For a start, most discussions of racism these days see racism as a discourse. And they do point out that there are different discourses and they might apply differently to different minorities. Now, I wanted to go away from that, so I use the notion of an imaginary to capture the fears, the nightmares, the fantasies, the caricatures, the stereotypes, and the jokes that make up a sense of who the other is in racist terms. And what I did was I looked at different ontologies of racism. I drew on Michel Viorca and Zygmunt Bauman, two scholars who have written a lot about racism. And I combined them to say that there were really three ontologies of racism. One of them was one of self-purification, which created physical expulsion, extermination. The other was of subordination, which led to physical exploitation of labor. And the third was assimilation, cultural destruction. And these, in some ways, fit onto these three figures, folk devils as I call them, the slave, the witch, and the Grand Inquisitor. So the slave is the exploited, the black laborer who is feared because he has the potential to be the insurrectionist, and he embodies the fears of sexuality run wild. He's the kind of slave of history who is the mugger. The second image is that of the witch, which is the Jew, and he is the conspirator, the apparently assimilated figure who actually is a nefarious feeder on the blood of children, Bolshevik, anarchist, capitalist, and so on. And the third is what I call the Grand Inquisitor. I could have called him the Grand Ayatollah, the jihadist, but he's I'm calling them all he's the in-your-face insurrectionist, the one who tells you that all your activities are immoral, that Westerners are, corrupt. And so I say that, I argue in the paper that the Grand Inquisitor, the jihadist, creates a postmodern fear. The fear of the slave, of sexuality run wild, it may have been a modern fear at a repressed age. The fear of the hidden conspirator, capitalist, was a fear in a society that thought that consumption was in some ways wrong or evil. But the Grand Inquisitor, he is the one who tells us you shouldn't consume, you shouldn't have sex, you shouldn't behave as you are. In other words, so he attacks us in a postmodern era. And therefore he encapsulates the fears not only of the working classes, but of intellectuals, of the middle class as well. He brings together different kinds of constituencies who all feel that he's endangered. So this is the first part of my paper. I argue, it's quite complicated, the argument, but I'm not going to go into it today. One of the points made by people who write about racism is that these fears encapsulate both the fear of difference and the fear of resemblance. So if you take, I'll just give this one example, the Grand Inquisitor, and I deliberately called this folk devil the Grand Inquisitor, he encapsulates our own fears of an era where religion imposed itself on us. We're familiar with this figure from our own history. And it's this resemblance that makes such a figure much more fearsome to us. Right, so then we get to current post-9/11 kinds of situation. And then I ask myself, well, maybe there's been a reversal or merging of these two figures, the figures of the witch, the conspirator, and the figure of the Grand Inquisitor, because after all, Muslims are now seen as plotters, seditious plotters behind the scenes, whereas Israel has become this very aggressive nation and is recognized for its aggression, its breaking of human rights. So maybe they've combined together. And I argue that, in fact, although Muslims do hide their conspiracies, they are still motivated by this in-your-face, open attack on the West. But the tragedy, and I see it much more, Brian, as a real tragedy, that what's happened is that Muslims and Jews now stereotype each other. So for me, the new anti-Semitism is coming out of the Muslim world, and it is very virulent. And it believes that the Jews are the crusaders and the conspirators. And the Jews on their side see Islam and Muslims as, violent and dangerous and wanting to destroy Israel. So this tragedy means that it's extremely difficult, especially for Jews in the diaspora, to criticize Israel. They find it very hard because there is what they see as a real anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. And then I go on to argue, and this is towards the end of the paper, that it's much easier for Israelis to criticize their own regime, so that you have a whole host of filmmakers and others who have engaged in self-critique without being accused of being anti-Semitic, whereas people who live outside Israel are accused of being self-hating Jews, and it's very difficult for them to escape that accusation. I give the example of Judge Goldstone, who wrote the report, who chaired the commission on the Gaza iron cast thing, and show how he actually changes his mind in public. He can't keep his stance of total critique of Israel. And so, yes, I think that the new anti-Semitism and the new Islamophobia, as it's played out today in international relations, is a tragedy which makes it extremely difficult to reach some kind of situation of trust between nations, between Arabs and Jews. And that's how I conclude. Thank you.
Have some time for questions and a discussion. I think what we'll do is gather up a number of comments or questions and then ask the three people up here to respond. And we have a roving mic or a person carrying. Jan is carrying a roving mic, and to save her from a terrible task, I think we'll take sort of one side of the room first and then another side, rather than have her alternating between sides from one question to another. So if we start with my left, of course. If anyone on my left, your right, who'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. All the way at the back, Jan.
So I'm looking at political cartoons and how we deem them, whether they're anti-Semitic or if they're making a political point. But one of the biggest challenges that we face is the fact that Israel describes itself as Jewish and democratic. So how can we then separate, criticizing Israel as a state when it mixes both the religion and the politics? It defines itself as both religious and a democracy. So how can we then separate the two if Israel itself doesn't?
Thank you. Well, yes. That's a question.
Thank you. I would like to ask the panel, how do you conceptualize, theorize, and explain the fact that most of the new right and extremist and racist movements and parties in Europe, they actually reclaim the Jews and the state of Israel as, in many respects, as their how do you make this connection?
Do they?
Well, let's take those two first.
Sure. First of all, shall I go back? The question you raised, I think, is really an important question. And perhaps one way to approach it is this. What you've said about Israel is also true, mutatis mutandis, for a number of Arab states in the region. In other words, the close connection between state and religion is true of several states in the region. And so the problem that you've raised, which is indeed a crucial problem, is not only a problem about Israel and anti-Semitism, it's also a problem concerning, if you like, Arab states and Islamophobia. And on the second question, I mean, my comment on that is that what seems to be happening, as far as I can see, is that a number of groups on the far right are trying to use support for Israel as a weapon with which to attack Islam and Muslims. I think, in other words, it is a tactic and nothing more than that.
David, can I say something? Yeah, I was going to respond to the question at the back. I mean, to say that the state is Jewish could mean simply that the culture is Jewish, that the language is Hebrew. It could have quite an innocent interpretation. The majority are Jewish. It's an identity. And so too that democracy is for all citizens equally. The problem is, and where your question carries this tragedy that I was talking about, that with the right-wing extremist government in Israel at the moment, it's taken both to an extreme where people who are not Jewish, who are citizens of the state of Israel, are being treated as second-class citizens. And therefore, the whole question of what democracy is really, up for grabs at the moment.
Do I need to touch this?
No.
Right. Great. I see. Thank you. Well, maybe I'll add something to what Pnina said and then answer the question that was asked here. I'm so far from being an expert on Israel that I hesitate to say this, but my recollection is that there is an article in the Constitution of the State of Israel, or a declaration
of Independence,
which says that all Jews are, is it the word citizens or belong?
All people of Israel are. It doesn't say all Jews, everybody.
Yeah. So that is to say that Jewish people in the room here belong to Israel in some form, in a form actually closer than Christians and Muslims in the state of Israel. So perhaps I think that's what the speaker at the back might have been getting at. But I'll just now pick up the other question. Yes, I think in a way related to what Brian Klug's already said, it's basically my enemy's enemy is my friend. So it is the case that quite a lot of right-wing anti-Muslim groups like the EDL praise Israel and often carry the flags of the Israeli state. Geert Wilders also has said that he has a lot of...
He's a Muslim now.
Sorry?
He's become a Muslim.
What?
Are you joking? Geert Wilders has converted. Right.
Which one was it?
Okay, well, I don't think he's likely to...
How long have we been in this room?
Another member of his party.
Okay, well, this may be related to the conspiratorial theme that's associated with Muslims and Islam that Pnina talked about. And of course, I think where it's most virulent actually is in the United States. The American right has become extremely Islamophobic and at the same time kind of ultra-Zionist. You know, they're trying to outdo, as it were, mainstream Israeli lobby and Zionism in the United States. So I agree with you, there is this phenomenon across a number of countries and movements, and I would say it's basically not so much really a genuine affection for Israel, but more like my enemy's enemy is my friend.
just on that second point, I certainly think there's an instrumental dimension to the solidarity which far-right groups now extend to Israel. But there is an appropriation of the Jewish story in Europe that the far-right appear to be rewriting, to the extent that Le Pen would characterize himself as the defender of European Jewry, and in the book we quote him as saying, "The Jews understand who is truly responsible for anti-Semitism," i.e. it's the Muslims over there. Now that seems to be an incredible inversion. But beyond the kind of dramatic and radical reorientations, I think there's something less so. There's the characterization of Judeo-Christian Europe as a Judeo-Christian activity, which finds expression in debates about, well, what is the identity of Europe? Where do non-Christian majority countries in Europe fit into this idea of the contemporary European Union? You find it very much rehearsed over the prospect of Turkish accession. So I don't know, I think beyond the instrumentalization, there's a kind of a wider discursive political trope which isn't about the sensational, isn't about the kind of short-term realignment. There's something deeper there.
I just wanted to add a brief sort of postscript, which is to say that I don't think we should get carried away with the idea that the far right have suddenly become ultra-Zionist. I mean, there are groups like Golden Dawn in Greece, which, as far as I'm aware, are still very sort of both anti-Semitic and anti-Israel.
Exactly.
And I think they're not the only one. So I think it's a more complex picture. Yeah.
I think it's most unlikely.
Yeah.
There's a question just there, Jan. We'll move to the other side of the room.
I just wanted to ask you why you chose to call the book Antisemitism and Islamophobia as opposed to Judeophobia and Islamophobia.
Thank you. I guess that's directed to me. Well, actually, it's called Racialization and Religion, and the subtitle is Race, Culture and Difference in the Study of Antisemitism and Islamophobia. And the whole objective was really to bring to bear the study of race and racism in our understanding of two bodies of material here. I couldn't rewrite the literature on anti-Semitism nor would I wish to. I do both as scholars of anti-Semitism, and I work with their concepts and I work with the knowledge that they're generating, rather than tell them that they have perhaps mistermed their object of study. In the same way that I didn't want to talk about purely Muslimophobia. I think, to some extent, and we discuss this in the book, this kind of semantic debate is a bit of a red herring. These concepts have now gained a traction that have an explanatory purchase to them. So trying to rewrite the concept, I don't think is necessarily the most helpful thing. I think the most helpful thing is to give content to those concepts in a way that help you do a meaningful form of analysis.
Is someone over there?
It's a slight disagreement actually with what you just said, and it's partly because I'm reading David Nurnberg's Anti-Judaism, and I was also in Israel recently, and an Israeli citizen of Moroccan heritage, now a Hebrew-speaking, a kind of Zionist in the sense that he defends the right of the state to exist, but is utterly critical of the government that he exists under. And he made the point to us very strongly that he didn't use the word anti-Semitism because he wants to kind of, partly in recognition of his Moroccan heritage, he wants to point out that the Semitic people is just a population group. And clearly what Nurnberg is doing is, and it picks up Brian's interesting distinction between the actual Jew and this kind of fantasy Jew that people who hate Jews have manufactured. And I do think it is quite useful actually to think of the phenomenon as anti-Judaism, partly in order to capture this idea of this figuration of a set of people who have a faith which particularly the Christians have constructed in this particularly virulent way. So I mean, I also don't like, huge semantic debates and things, and I know that most people do. And until this summer, I would have used the word.
But that would imply.
But I now think that there is some point in being more precise, and perhaps the way you were implying as well.
But I think that would imply that it's against the religion of Judaism, which is completely wrong, because the figure of the Jew is a racialized figure. And in some periods there has been an element of religion in it, but that's not the main thing. Is that the Jew is regarded as the stranger, the unassimilable stranger who pretends to be part of this society. That's anti-Semitism. Anti-Judaism may be another thing entirely.
Well, I mean, in the book, I defer in my chapter, the last chapter, to Jacobson, who argues that the history of racial Jewishness is not merely the history of anti-Semitism. It encompasses the ways in which both Jews and non-Jews have been constructed Jewishness over time. And we spent some time dwelling on that, and took up Hannah Arendt's very persuasive argument that that's not an unproblematic thesis. That for a long time, anti-Semitism was the preserve of crackpots and the lunatic fringe in Europe, whereas whereas Judeophobia, has a much deeper historical root to it. So we engage with that debate in the book.
Let's have some more over there, and then.
Thank you very much. A question really for Tariq, if I can. I mean, we run a project nationally on anti-Muslim prejudice and monitoring it. And one of the problems we've had over the last 2 years, we are making some progress, has been the fact that since '97, since the Runnymede Trust's definition, quote unquote, Islamophobia, there has been a vacuum. And that vacuum really has not provided a working description of what Islamophobia or anti-Muslim prejudice is. I guess we're grappling with that, but do you agree that area there is still quite a significant void in that area, which causes a lot of angst and discussion around free speech, debate, critical criticism of religion, etc.?
Vic Side of Goldsmiths. I've been working on the fallout of the 9/11, and it seems important to kind of recognize when we're talking about Islamophobia and in some way anti-Semitism, to be much more historically specific about how these take on different forms and intensities in relationship to particular historical events. So the ways in which we began to conceive or had to take seriously Islamophobia had to do with the kind of fallout in relationship to 9/11. So there are difficulties, particularly when we think in terms of philosophical distinctions or even syntactical distinctions, about how we recognize and begin to think about the kind of historical specificity that we're trying to engage with. And further than that, one of the absences or the second absence, because it's very difficult because there are so many questions that have been kind of brought out by different speakers, is that the language of racialization, which is the project of the book, is in some way a secular language. It is quite specifically a language that's been framed in questions of race and ethnicity in ways that find it very difficult, and I think this links to Tariq's kind of warning or kind of raising a question, as to how we think the relationship or questions of religion. And the distinctions between the secular and the religious, and how the distinction between racialization doesn't really enable us to open up questions about the place of Christianity and the way in which Islam and Judaism sit in different positions in relationship to Christianity, and the way in which the West, in its conception of a dominant Christian culture, frames this notion of Judeo-Christian, which in some way is itself a construction. It's a way in which Jews have accommodated, in part, to a Christian framing which says this kind of Judeo-Christian tradition in a way to silence post-Holocaust actual framings. So the issue was, why did it take so long for questions of race and ethnicity to take on anti-Semitism and to take on Islamophobia? What's the analysis that the book provides for those kinds of silences, and then the explanation that the book gives of the difficulties of opening the question around secular and religion, and taking religions in some way seriously as moral traditions?
I don't need a mic.
I think you do.
Sorry. I'd like to thank all the speakers. I've just got a question that's really Tariq and Brian. Brian seems to be, you seem to be arguing, you're in the room, you seem to be arguing that there's a gap, an unbridgeable gap between Jews and the Jew. Flesh and blood Jews and the concept of Jew, or the Jew. Tariq seems, as far as I've just heard this evening, that it's about misrecognition, that there is somehow a gap, there is somehow a connection between the image of the Muslim that's produced by Islamophobia and the real life of Muslims. And that seems a difference. And for my part, I'm with Brian on this one. And it seems to me that you want almost a Habermasian public space where we can say, we're really not that bad, we're actually very nice people. And I think whilst misrecognition is a part of it, it strikes me that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism is about no recognition. And I think Brian's right in a way to get that, to recognize that gap between reality and the racialized concept, if I can say that. And finally, the third speaker, in a way, was interesting because she plays, I couldn't catch her name.
Pnina.
Sorry?
Pnina.
Pnina sort of put it within the context of a distortion of social relations, which gave rise to the image of the Muslim, the black, and the Jew, which sort of, in a way, God, I hate Hegel, mediates those first two speakers. So that's more a comment than a question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, let's come back to the panel. Nasar, do you want to
Okay.
start?
Well, I'll take Vic's question, actually, directly. I mean, there's a great deal in what you say that I agree with. And really what the book sets out to do is follow some of those signposts which you've identified. And it would cheat me out of a sale if I answered your question entirely. What I would say is that, well, two things. One, we question or point to that long-standing methodological, indeed philosophical debate about whether the possession of a concept needs to predate the development of a word. And so in the introduction, we go back to Shakespeare, and via Shakespeare, we actually go a little bit further back. And we talk about the way in which there's a kind of a prevalent racializing discourse of some figures in Shakespearean work. And, even though they're very polysemic, we can say that there's a particular characteristic that Shakespeare attributes to Shylock, a particular characteristic that he associates with Othello. And the subtitle of one chapter is Othello and Shylock walk into a bard, which I think is the best part of the book. Well, my contribution to the book. But in terms of your core question, which is why did it take race so long to catch up, is that, as I began saying at the outset, I think for a long time the idea of race has been anchored around an Atlantocentric view of racism, and that story begins in, it begins with the slave trade, it begins with the kind of European sanctioned colonialism, which is kind of, almost 700-800 years after we want to start our story. And of course, when you think about 1492 and you think about the Reconquista, you see how salient the language of race is within that. Yet, until quite recently, until people like Fredrickson and then Francois Sawyer, that hasn't really been placed within the racialization thesis proper. Even those who kind of promote racialization thesis as a generic set of tools to analyze racism, people like Michael, Omi, and Winnan, argue that that's just a rehearsal for racialization proper, which happens, from the 17th century onwards. So there's kind of been an intellectual resistance to it, I think, as well as I said at the beginning, perhaps a political one.
Yeah, I mean, for me, racism, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, color racism, as it's sometimes called, starts from the questions of fear and violence and violation. And if you want to call those particular analytic categories, and that's fair enough. But I've never thought of anti-Semitism as separated from racism, because I see, and I think Tariq has said this in a book which I edited with him, but maybe he's changed his mind if I answer, that these cultural categories take on a biological, naturalized aspect to them. So they may start off as culture or religion or something, but they become imbricated and embodied and naturalized, so that they seem to be true in a natural way. And therefore, I think that, without doubt, racism is always historically inflected. And it differs for different groups at different times. And at one point, maybe religion was more dominant in the attitude to the Jews of Europe during the Crusades than it was in the 19th century or in the 20th century. But the point is that it's always a matter of having a sense that you are going to be attacked by this very dangerous outsider. And that's at the heart of these racist stereotypes. Obviously, I don't agree that they're true, and in that way Brian is right, but these are real fears that people have, real perceptions of danger coming from the outside. And it's equally true of Muslims and of Jews and of blacks, for those who fear these things.
Well, I'll quickly comment on something Pnina has attributed to me. I think Pnina's thinking about... Pnina and I go a long way back. We edited some books together, oh God, when God was a boy or something.
That's the preamble.
And I think you're thinking about my chapter in one of the books we edited, where I said I disagreed with what you've just attributed to me. So yes, in the text you can find that view, but I put it up in order to say that I don't think that...
I edited the book. I know what you said. Better than you do.
Well, I wrote it. So I'm against the view that cultural racism uses forms of naturalism. I mean, I'm not saying it never does, but I'm against the view that analyses only make sense if they use ideas that are naturalistic or quasi-naturalistic. I think cultural racism makes sense in its own right. For instance, if we think about stereotypes about Asians, they are very family-oriented. They work very hard. They don't take enough holidays because they want to earn more money. They're too much into religion, in fact, even religious fanatics. None of those is supposed to be true in any biological sense. The worst anti-Asian racist you can find doesn't believe in that it somehow belongs to the genes of Asians that they have those characteristics. They attribute those characteristics to aspects of Asian community structures and upbringings and behaviors. So cultural racism is a self-evident form of racism without needing a theoretical gloss which says, cultural racism is really a way of kind of harking back to a biological racism. So I was trying to say the opposite.
But it's in their blood. It's in their blood,
It's not. No. So hi Fiaz. So Fiaz was referring to the project Tell Mama, a great project. But your suggestion that since the Runnymede Commission's report that there's a void, that nothing useful has been done on Islamophobia, well, really, I'd like to say the opposite. I think we have lots of good studies, and they are accumulating, and in particular, I would say in the last 2, 3, 4 years, they now amount to quite a critical mass. So if you put Islamophobia into your Google search engine, and if that doesn't bring you out the stuff, then use Google Scholar. You'll find lots of stuff, and even if you're defeated after that, if you email me, I'll send you a bibliography. Yes, your question about Brian's use of the Jew, as in T.S. Eliot's The Jew, and my own view that we can't understand representations of groups of people in an kind of an analytical frame, especially if, as I want to argue, for normative analytical frames, so analytical frames that have some notion of equality and emancipation in them. We can't do that without having some sense of the people, not just the representations of the people, but of the people. So it may be the case that the Muslim of Islamophobic discourses has to be understood, attacked, repeatedly attacked, because it's so powerful, and we need precise analysis, but we also need strong political dissemination. But it can't be the case that once we've disseminated all that, and even supposing that it's successful, that the Muslim no longer exists, because Muslims will exist. And our analyses should recognize the subjectivity and agency of people who think they're Muslims, not just of the representation of non-Muslims about the Muslim. So I'm actually kind of resisting this quite seriously large trend in social theory and sociology over the last 20, 30 years, which substitutes the study of social groups with the study of representations about those groups. And that's what I was trying to get at when I said the 1970s and 80s anti-racism. I'd like to think we've gone beyond that, but unfortunately Islamophobia could be, some aspects of the study of Islamophobia could be heading in the same direction. Yes, so I think that's my answer.
Well, listening to you just now, Tariq, it seems to me that the criticism that you're making, excuse me, with respect to a certain approach to Islamophobia could also be made of Sartre's famous book on the anti-Semitism. I forget the name of the book. What's the name of the book? Right, thank you.
You said that without moving your lips, David.
What's it called?
That book was a great contribution, I think, to thinking about anti-Semitism, but it seems in the end to leave out the real sort of flesh and blood Jew who identifies as such and has an identity that is independent of the identity that is being projected onto her or him. I really want to use what is probably my last opportunity to contribute, right, because we're close to being out of time, to comment on a thread that has come up, I think, in a number of different contributions. And may I say that I've found the comments tonight really very interesting and thought-provoking. And I want to sort of go away and think about some of them. I'd like to identify this thread by going back to something you said about racialization being a secular language. And what I'm inclined to say about that is, yes, I suppose in a way it is, but I think it's also a language that brings out something that perhaps is either overlooked or lost. When you talk about Judaism and Christianity and Islam in, let's say, purely theological terms, one of the things that's striking to me about the image of the Muslim and the image of the Jew, when you go back and look at the development over a period of time, is the way in which it survives the sea change from the theological debate, if you will, in the Middle Ages to the Enlightenment. Because at the end of the day, the Jew and the Muslim, as perceived in a lot of Enlightenment literature, of course one has to be careful here not to overgeneralize, it's very like the image of the Jew and the image of the Muslim that you could find in Christian theological writing or religious writing before the Enlightenment. And so that gets you thinking, what then was the status of that image before we had the language that the Enlightenment provides us with. And this is what I was trying to get at in my little talk when I was saying that the figure of the Jew is portable, that it can cross ideological divides, and it applies whether you think of Jews as a people, as a culture, as a race, as an ethnicity, or indeed as members of a religious community. And that, I think, also applies to Islamophobia. So in that connection, and this is my final comment, I think we have to be careful not to get hung up on words, because the distinction between anti-Judaism and Islamophobia, between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism and Judeophobia, these are three words that get sort of used in the literature, and as far as I've been able to see, they don't get used consistently. Sometimes they're used with the sort of clarity of distinction that you were drawing, and sometimes they seem to be used interchangeably. And my feeling about it is, let's look past the word and see what the concept is. Wittgenstein says somewhere in the investigation something like this: say what you like, so long as it doesn't prevent you from seeing the facts.
That's a very fine note on which to end the sort of round table part of the discussion.